Nodutdol posted about the South Korean Ministry of Justice report that found a nearly 70% increase in US military crimes from 2018 to 2023. For context, there are more than 24,000 US troops stationed in South Korea. Can you expand on the findings and repercussions, if any, from the publishing of the report?
Yeah. So the report details everything from DUIs to property crime and theft to assaults. So it's a wide range of types of crimes that are included in this. And there were nearly 600 incidents in 2023 alone. What's key to understand, however, is that under the Status of Forces Agreement, which is a military treaty governing the presence of US troops in Korea, US soldiers actually enjoy very broad protection from ROK law. In fact, they used to have complete immunity, and that changed after a case in the 1990s when a US soldier murdered a Korean woman, Yoon. And the way that the Status of Forces Agreement operates now is that in extreme cases, such as murder or rape, US soldiers are subject to prosecution by ROK or South Korean authorities. However, there are still extreme restrictions and safeguards in place that prevent South Korean authorities from actually investigating or detaining US soldiers. So what that means is that when you have so-called minor crimes, and I would point out that minor includes things like DUIs, it includes things like property damage and vandalism, it includes assaults. So like, if a soldier gets drunk and like crashes his car and causes property damage or damage to a person, everyone can see it happen before their eyes, but unless there is a willingness from the US military to cooperate, the South Korean authorities actually cannot officially move forward with an investigation because they can open a case, but they can't actually bring the guy in for questioning, right? And so, from a legal standpoint, that means that these cases are officially unsolved, but they're being reported in this way as U.S. military crimes because essentially the details of what happened make it very, very evident that these were crimes that were, if not absolutely, then very likely committed by U.S. soldiers, right? And I think examining some of the cases in the report is very illuminating. There's at least one incident of a US soldier who was seen tearing down anti-base banners that were put up by locals who are opposed to the US military presence. So it's actually US soldiers committing crimes because that is considered vandalism in South Korea, committing crimes for political purposes as well, right? To intimidate the local population and to, oppose their efforts to resist the occupation of their land. And in terms of the political impact of the report, I do need to point out that the report came out close to the last week of the snap election, which just took place in South Korea. So it was politically a very busy time. And so I wouldn't say that the impact of the report has actually been that wide beyond the circles of people that are interested in this sort of thing. And I think, that also reflects how the occupation works in South Korea, because I think, it's easy for us to say there's this many troops, there's that many military bases. If you haven't been to South Korea, it might be hard to visualize it. You might begin to think like, oh, like South Korea is just a country where there are military bases everywhere. That is true. And at the same time, it's a country where the majority of people go about their day-to-day lives without interactions with the US military because the US military is concentrated in specific places and there are forms of actually segregation that exist to keep the civilian population separate from the US military outside of specific zones. So those who interact with the US military are very aware of its crimes and its dangers, but that's not the case for most people. US soldiers have their own housing on bases that are separated from the rest of people by walls, by barbed wire, by armed guards, right? And when you consider the conditions inside those bases, you have to kind of understand that they're kind of like gated communities in a way, right? There's also tend to be neighborhoods in local cities that are close to US bases, places that are like colloquially referred to as camp towns where US soldiers tend to spend their leisure time. So these aren't typically places that a lot of regular Korean people are going to go, right? Because they're sort of understood as US areas, right? And you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time there unless you have some sort of business there. And in addition to that, at least when I was growing up, I'm not as sure about it now, but when I was growing up, there were even businesses in Seoul close to the military base that you could not enter if you did not have a foreign passport. So essentially, these were no Koreans bars, right? And so as a result, as I said, a lot of people don't have this day-to-day interaction. And that's part of how the occupation maintains itself, and also why, officially at least, the US military does actually have an interest in exerting discipline over its ranks and preventing US soldiers from, running completely amok among the Korean population, because they know that negative public opinion is actually to their disadvantage. But, as we see from the report, you can still have a situation where you have close to 600 crimes in a single year, despite these official attempts at discipline and control over the soldiery.